his 1997 book, The Cult of Emptiness, Roger Paul Drouin illuminates a paradox. While Buddhism is widely considered today as a religion characterized by the compassion it promotes for all beings, major 19th century philosophers such as Hegel, Nietzsche, Cousin, Taine, and Renan portrayed Buddhism as, quote, a dangerous negation of phenomenal reality, an attempt at destroying the will through the negation of suffering and existence, and a path towards an increase of selfishness. Such a dim view of Buddhism was grounded on the thinker's understanding of one specific Buddhist concept, the concept of nirvana. According to the Buddha's teaching, nirvana requires overcoming, quote, the three destructive roots, desire, hatred, and delusion, and ending active volition. The group of 19th century philosophers examining Drouin's The Cult of Emptiness evaluated the entire Buddhist doctrine against the yardstick of nirvana. In the search of this goal, they perceived a dangerous fascination with self-destruction and, in Buddhism as a whole, a nihilistic religion preaching the destruction of the self. According to Drouin, the genealogy of the Western interpretation of Buddhism as a cult of nothingness finds its origin in the work of Hegel. Quote, in the philosophical imagination, Hegel established the link between Buddha and nothingness for several decades. It thus paved the way for a long and diverse connection between Buddha and nihilism, setting up a kind of obligatory link between the supposed doctrine of Buddha and the theme of destruction. In Hegel's perspective, the concept of nothingness permeates the entire Buddhist system as it stands at the origin and the horizon of all things, which end up returning to this primordial state of indetermination. In his analysis of the sources used by Hegel to reach his understanding of nothingness, Drouin observes that the German philosopher privileged over more recent sources a conception of Buddhism that found its origin in 18th century texts predating the constitution of modern Orientalism. Nonetheless, Drouin does not mention anywhere the name of one of the first European philosophers who reflected on the Buddha's doctrine, Pierre Bayle. While Drouin credits Hegel with the creation of a link between Buddhism and nothingness, my intention today consists in showing that the association between these two concepts has a far longer history in which Bayle played a pivotal role. Consequently, the goals pursued by this presentation are twofold. First, it was established that the analysis devoted by Bayle to Buddhism in the Historical and Critical Dictionary prefigures the 19th century description of this religion as a cult of nothingness and constitutes one of Hegel's indirect sources. In other words, the genealogy of the interpretation of Buddhism as a cult of nothingness would be incomplete without a critical assessment of French sources in general and of Bayle's work in particular. In addition, my second goal consists in suggesting that the history of the Western discovery of Buddhism is not defined by a clear-cut rupture between two periods, one anterior to the 19th century and defined by approximations, repetitions, errors, and a new one initiated in the 1820s and progressively moving towards an accumulation of rigorous knowledge. Such a clear-cut rupture is posited by Drouin, who speaks of an old and a new story of Buddhism and insists as well on a turning point around the 1820s. Nonetheless, the rupture between these so-called two stories is contradicted by the very analysis undertaken in The Cult of Nothingness. Drouin indeed showed that 19th century philosophers who had access to the work recently published by Orientalists on the Tibetan, Nepalese, Indian, and Chinese tradition of Buddhism, either found their information in pre-19th century sources or caricatured the findings of these scientific studies. Although Drouin contends that a new era in the Western interpretation of Buddhism was born at the outset of the 19th century, the Cult of Nothingness underlines the intellectual depths owed by these modern thinkers to their early modern predecessors. In other words, the so-called new story of Buddhism owes a great deal to the Old One. Building on Dwight's suggestion that the Western interpretation of Buddhism is a mirror in which Europe contemplates its own fears and aspirations, which is to say that perhaps Buddhism in the West is the still continuing history of its own interpretation. I will show that Bayle played a key role in the construction of one of the most lasting interpretations of Buddhism in the West. So part one, Buddhism and Spinozism. Bayle's historical and critical dictionary, of which 2 editions appeared in his lifetime in 1697 and 1702, made him one, if not the most influential thinkers of this time. Among the many topics touched by Bayle in his dictionary, Buddhism occupies at first glance a relatively small place, as only a handful of articles discuss aspects of this religion. Nonetheless, the impact of these articles across Europe is inversely proportional to their number. Bayle's most influential text on Buddhism is actually an article dedicated to Spinoza. As understood by Bayle, Spinozism is another name of a philosophical system that has been omnipresent in the East for centuries. Buddhism and Spinozism are actually so similar in Bayle's eyes that Buddhism appears as a primitive Spinozism and Spinozism as the latest Western systematization of principles that the Buddha's disciples have been following for centuries. Bayle built this connection between Spinozism and Buddhism on the basis of 2 concepts, monism and pantheism. Bayle starts by observing that monism and pantheism are ancient systems. Quote, "People have been believing for a long time that the universe is one substance and that God and the Word are one being only." Characterized by its geometrical construction, Spinoza's system manifests an intuition of the nature of the world that numerous philosophers, such as the Stoics, have embraced long before him. Spread out in the West since the antiquity, this system is also present in the East, as observed by Bayle, which was a parallel between Spinozism and the Chinese branch of Buddhism. Bayle's description of Buddhism insists on its division between 2 doctrines, the exterior doctrine, which is taught to the common people, and the interior doctrine, which is reserved to an elite. Adopting a distinction that he found in the Catechismus of Alessandro Verdignano, a Jesuit missionary who lived in Japan in the mid-16th century, Bayle showed that the goal of the exterior doctrine consists in providing a moral compass to the people. The exterior doctrine thus asserts the ontological difference between evil and goodness, the existence of an afterlife where people will be punished or rewarded on the basis of their actions, and it also lists a number of moral precepts that his followers are encouraged to follow. In other words, the interior doctrine promulgates provisional truth to the masses on the basis of their perceived incapacity to elevate themselves to the truth contained in the interior doctrine. So the interior doctrine is only known by the initiates, and it contains the true teachings of the Buddha and thus constitutes the real doctrinal core of his religion. This is actually a crucial point for our discussion today, as it helps explain the focalization of 19th century philosophers on the idea of nothingness. If the interior doctrine is the true doctrine and nothingness its most fundamental principle, a demonstration of the contradiction inherent in these concepts strikes Buddhism at its very core and negates the need of further discussions dedicated to peripheral tenets. According to Bayle's description of the interior doctrine, the Buddha's disciples believe that nothingness is the one and only substance, and that the differences between beings are comparable to the distinct forms of water, which are always substantially water, whether they take the form of snow, rain, or ice. In other words, nothingness plays several metaphysical functions within the interior doctrine, as it appears as both an Eastern equivalent of the Christian first principle, and as the substance whose modifications create separate beings, a thesis that is strikingly similar to Spinoza's pantheism. In conclusion, Bayle is interested in proving that monism and pantheism have a long history as well as a wide diffusion, from Valiniano's Japan to Spinoza's Netherlands, from the Greek Stoics to the Chinese disciples of the Buddha. Indeed, Bayle used the commonalities he perceived between geographically and historically diverse thinkers to bolster a non-theistic consensus in which nothingness took the place of an omnipotent and benevolent creator of the world. In the end, Bayle's genealogy of Spinozism, by insisting on the continuities he perceived between Eastern and Western forms of monism and atheism, was central to the creation of a specific interpretation of Buddhism as a nihilistic cult of nothingness. Which takes me to my second part, nothingness from Bayle to Hegel. So in this second part, my goal consists now in mapping the diffusion from Bayle to Hegel of four central ideas in the conception of Buddhism as a cult of nothingness. These four key ideas are the description of nothingness as a first principle, the concept of monism, the concept of quietism, and the distinction between the Buddha's two doctrines. These ideas appear in numerous texts published from the beginning of the 18th century to the mid-19th century, as demonstrated by the excerpts attached to this presentation. So from Bayle to Hegel, a remarkable consistency of ideas and metaphors is indeed on display. Bayle's successors borrowed his definition of nothingness as both the origin and destination of all things, and interpreted nothingness as the substance of all phenomena. As a result, monism is inherent to their understanding of nothingness, since they conceive nothingness to be another name of the essence of all things. In addition, Bayle's successors borrowed from his dictionary the description of Buddhism as a form of quietism, a thesis that is derived from his definition of nothingness as an immovable principle, free from desires and passions. Seen in this light, quietism among the Buddha's disciples is the ethical result of the imitation of the first principle. Hegel alludes to the negation of all dualistic differences within this oriental form of quietism, which is a consequence of a monism characterizing both the physical world and the realm of ethics. If nothingness is all there is, then the distinction between good and evil is conventional, as they are deep down one and the same. Finally, the distinction between the exterior and the interior doctrine leads Bayle's successors to complementary forms of criticism. First, the exterior doctrine resonates with some of the central tenets of Christianity, such as the existence of an afterlife where good and evil deeds meet their just consequences. These similarities were accurately felt by many of Bayle's successors, in particular Diderot and his fellow encyclopedists, who were critical of Buddhism on the basis of its perceived affinity with Christianity. As for the interior doctrine, it was the object of a second form of criticism among Bayle's successors, as it seemed to induce a troubling form of apathy with potentially destructive effects for the social fabric. Consequently, both doctrines led to partially contradictory but ultimately convergent forms of rejection, which were integral to the 19th century interpretation of Buddhism as a threatening cult of nothingness. So, in conclusion, it is in Bayle's dictionary that the criticism disseminated through successive texts to Hegel, and from Hegel to the group of thinkers studied by Droit, finds its origin. Such a genealogy proved first that pre-19th century sources played a key role in the modern understanding of Buddhism in the West, as they influenced the contemporaries and successors of the Orientalists who started working on Buddhist texts in the early 1800s. It also demonstrates that, far from being the product of the 19th century, The interpretation of Buddhism as a cult of nothingness has its roots in one of the earliest intellectual encounters between Westerners and Buddhist scholars. The encounter that took place in 16th century Japan, documented by Valiniano's Catechismus, and communicated by Bayle to a wider readership, thanks to his best-selling work. And finally, invites us to recognize in the Western encounter with Buddhism an ongoing story in which the selection of specific concepts results from the intellectual contest taking place in the West. From Bayle to Hegel, commentators of Buddhism chose to reflect on nothingness, because this particular discussion was a proxy to debate hotly contested topics in Europe, such as theories of materialism and pantheism as well. As a result, the selection of specific concepts within the Buddha's doctrine can be seen as an indirect indication of the main intellectual preoccupation of Westerners at a given time, reflecting on the current state of their culture as they zero in on one aspect of the Buddha's teachings. Western commentators speak about themselves as they undertake the analysis of this religion from a self-revelatory angle. Consequently, the interpretation of Buddhism in the West is always an indirect commentary on the state of Western civilization. If the interpretation of Buddhism as a cult of nothingness is so foreign to us today, it comes from the fact that the major preoccupations of our age are leading us to select different concepts within the Buddhist doctrine. Nowadays, the construction of a non-religious Buddhism, offering spiritual guidance, solace through meditation, reflects the modern aspiration of Westerners living in a commodified and scientific age. A new operation of intellectual selection has been taking place at the beginning of the 20th century, leaving aside nothingness and focusing instead on doctrinal aspects, portraying a Buddhism Westerners are ready to accept because it resembles what they aspire to see in it, a form of wisdom from which are systematically excluded the elements nonetheless present in traditional Buddhism, such as its complex rituals and its different realms of existence inhabited by ghosts and hungry spirits. Freely adapting some of the doctrinal elements they borrow from the Buddha's teachings, Westerners thus reject the aspects they deem to be in contradiction with the idea of Buddhism they wish to uphold, a secular philosophy in which they can find an art of living, providing balance in an ever-changing world. The fact that Buddhism is today broadly conceived in the West as a cult of happiness rather than a cult of nothingness has led to a commodification of the Buddha's image and a trivialization of his doctrine, which inspires brands, business names, and marketing strategies. This evolution does not signal a reversal of interpretation. More exactly, it is the latest embodiment of the West's attempt to answer the prevalent question of its time through the intermediary of the religion established by the Buddha.